Well, just a word of thanksgiving to start. Pastor Chris is currently in Scotland having a wonderful time. But we are really blessed today, too, to welcome Pastor Steve Hokinson, who is stepping in the interim after Pastor Deb has retired. And this is his first Sunday with us in this role. So can we just give him a hand? Thank him for his service. It is so good to have you with us, Steve. Well, we continue our sermon series today on the library of faith resources called the Psalms. Looking closely today at Psalm 30, a psalm of thanksgiving, and with the subtitle, A Song for the Dedication of the Temple of David. I'll get more to that later. But we have been spending quite a bit of time on the Psalms this summer, even going really deep this last week with about 30 of our 4-year-old through 5th graders at VBS. I just wanted to start by sharing just a couple of really memorable little snippets. One of the best moments for me was in the morning session. Our young ones made trumpets and drums and cymbals to play along with a rendition of Psalm 33 that was written by Robin Kane. And it was so cool to see them express the Psalms with their whole bodies and singing and dancing and shouting out to God. As you know, they were especially good at the shouting out part. We also lifted up Psalm 5 and this message that God wraps each of us in love like a blanket. And we talked about the prayer shawl ministry here at Trinity. And each kiddo received a small white baptismal shawl, and they wrapped around their shoulders to be reminded of the ways that God is always with them. And one boy said afterwards, "I'm going to sleep with mine tonight." And another girl actually liked her shawl so much that she brought it back the next day and wore it in kind of different ways throughout the whole morning. And then we had our big celebration and worship service with all the families out on the green, with lots of songs and actions and campfire s'mores. And just as we were taking bites of marshmallow and chocolate, the beautiful Stillwater sky was filled with hot air balloons, just silhouetting across the blue evening sky. Maybe some of you saw that on Wednesday night too. Just gorgeous, just a yay God moment. It was the kind of night that Psalms are made of. And just this picture of thanksgiving and praise to God for so many great connections and wonderful impact volunteers finding ways to express our faith together through the Psalms. And there'll be lots of super cute photos in the Trinity today in July for you to take a look at. I think that's a pretty good segue for and kind of the way the rhythm of the Psalms work, because as I said today, we are looking at a psalm of thanksgiving. Over the past few weeks, we've gone through some of the big genres of psalms: praise psalms, psalms of lament, psalms for trust, like the 23rd Psalm. And today is a psalm of thanks. The great and still living Old Testament commentator Walter Brueggemann writes that these psalms of thanks bear witness to the surprising gift of new life just when none had been expected. The Psalms of thanks bear witness to the surprising gift of new life just when none had been expected. Kind of like that hot air balloon show over the Stillwater sky after a very tiring but very joyful week. Unexpected and new and beautiful. But even more so, these psalms share how God acts in the midst of hard and turbulent times. These psalms speak to those who have been brought through dark and deep crises by God. Those who have gotten to the end of their rope and literally let go, but were found waiting in the arms of God, being wrapped like that shawl in God's love. These psalms capture that feeling of when we thought it was totally over, where there was just no path forward or no way out or no way up. But somehow, some way, God lifts us back up again. I think each of us can probably point to a moment like that in our lives, when we have been pulled out of that pit of despair, when we have been brought through the stages of grief to the other side of that shore of love. When we hurt someone or did something that we thought was totally unforgivable and experienced that sheer grace that reconnected us and set us free again in relationship. These Psalms move us to that point of gratitude with God. That reminder that suffering, though part of the story, is never all or the end of the story. Instead, what the psalmist keeps writing is that God continues to move us toward new life, unexpected new doors, surprising new windows that move us to thanksgiving. The story that came to mind for me was about a year ago when we were camping out at Wild River State Park. It was sort of our first big camping trip as the four. And we planned lots of special accommodations for Emily, who was about 1 at the time, the right air mattresses, the right cool down gear. And it was a totally beautiful experience. We had a fabulous time hiking, making food over the fire, until about 5 minutes before we had to head back home. It's always that last 5 minutes, isn't it? Well, we were breaking down our tent and our hammock and hustling to try to get everything into our minivan, while Ella and Emily were just sort of playing around the campsite. Well, they got close to the fire gate, which had just cooked hot dogs over, and Emily, who was a little over 1, as I said at the time, and very mobile, had tripped, and instead of using the ground or her sister's arm to get herself back up, she actually grabbed the hot fire grate. There are few things that will stick with a dad or a mom longer than those screams. Nobody wants to hear those screams. It was terrible, and we tried to do our best to quickly triage and bandage the wound, but she was just in so much pain. More pain than she's ever been in her little life. And so we took off as fast as we could to the closest hospital to get her burns treated. Thankfully, though it was not a quick process, we eventually went home with her clean bandages and some bacitracin with the promise of a full recovery. And her hand looks great today. But it was a moment when life literally stopped for us. And we moved along that line in the Psalms, though not as quickly and definitely not just overnight, from weeping to joy, from mourning to dancing again. We moved from shock and horror and trauma to thanksgiving for the healing presence of doctors and nurses and the amazing power of God in our bodies that continues to help heal us. It's that kind of movement that the psalmist repeats over and over again, that weeping may linger for the night, but joy does come in the morning. That you have turned my sadness into dancing, you have put off my grief and clothed me with joy. I cried out to you, God, and you restored me to health. God's anger lasts for a moment, but God's love lasts forever. What's clear in the Psalms is that it's not a sugarcoating of life or just trying to paint a rosy picture with God, but suffering is never the end result. Struggle after struggle is never God's goal. Pain is never the final word. Instead, what we hear in the Psalm of Thanks is that God meets us when and where it's tough and promises to never let us go. Martin Luther King Jr. shared this kind of similar message of hope through the civil rights movement, that the arc of human history is long, but it bends towards justice. God keeps moving us along that needle. God stays with us until the dawn breaks. God stays with us until our chains are gone. God stays with us until our fear subsides. God stays with us until our grief turns to love. God stays with us until our divorce or that tough relationship turns to a new chapter. God stays with us until we recover from surgery. God stays with us until we find forgiveness for someone who might have hurt us. God stays with us until those screams cease and we actually do want to go camping again. I think we're almost there. I think each of us moves through this rhythm of the Psalms at some point or many points in our lives. And the Psalms are words of encouragement for these kind of challenging and turbulent moments. One of the interesting things that Psalm 30 says is that it's entitled as a psalm of thanksgiving, a song for the dedication of the Temple of David. This psalm likely refers to the rebuilding and dedication following the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians. It was a psalm of thanks to God for helping the people to start again, to start anew, and to have a new space, a safe space to live, to celebrate, to work, and to worship God. What I like about that context is that these words of the psalmist are really good news for us as individuals. But what they also do is point us to a word of good news for others, for our whole community, for the sake of our neighbors. That we all need a safe place without the sound of screams. And God keeps us moving toward that safety. As many of you know, we are living in a migration crisis right now that is higher than the numbers since World War II. There's something like 65 million migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers away from their homes right now and afraid of what they might go back to. And many nations are struggling with how to respond and how to react given so many people trying to find that kind of safety and home again. And we are in a moment in this country when we are needing that surprising gift of new life when none is expected. I think as people of faith, as Christians with a story that often involves migration and this kind of movement from one place to another, from being a stranger in a new place or having to rebuild again, or how we welcome others, we are called to be a people that seeks justice and compassion for all those who are on the move and seeking safety, trying to find calm from the screams. As a pastor, I want to be very clear about what the Bible says, about what it means for us to be the norm of our faith and life. And I believe deeply that we are called to treat our neighbors with love and care no matter who they are. And we have to be clear about those values that continually ground us. It's not biblical to treat migrants and refugees like animals. It's not biblical to take children away from their parents. It's not biblical to ignore the needs of the stranger and the foreigner. It's not biblical to enforce any unjust laws or to use Scripture to justify that treatment. The ELCA, along with lots of other Protestant and Catholic leaders, have come out strongly against this zero-tolerance policy at the southern border right now and practices that would separate families. And I think that the Psalms of Thanksgiving give us good language for these kind of hard and difficult moments as a people. God promises to keep moving us out of this kind of suffering. But the reality is, we are often the ones that God calls and equips, like doctors and nurses healing burns, to be the ones to face those challenges. Our response to Thanksgiving, our joy and our dance can never be just simply for ourselves, but must move us to share what God has done and continues to do in rebuilding and recreating and making new opportunities and new stories in the world. God promises to never leave us here, but to keep calling us and challenging us to make life better for us, for our neighbors, for the whole world that God has made. May we continue to live out these Psalms, finding thanksgiving and healing for all of us. Thanks be to God. Amen.